Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Ever mindful Derek here, aware and present, attending to the things that are most essential for my well-being and yours. I've so enjoyed this Owen Barfield series, and I hope you have as well. Today's episode features a conversation with returning guest and friend of The Plunge, none other than Stephen Dunning. Stephen received his PhD in literature from the University of Cambridge, which he attended as a Commonwealth scholar. For many years, he was an English instructor at Douglas College in New Westminster, British Columbia. In 2007, he joined the English faculty of Trinity Western University, where he taught until 2017. He is the author of The Crisis and the Quest, a Kierkegaardian reading of Charles Williams, and of many articles on modern British and Canadian literature. In 2013, he co-founded the Inklings Institute of Canada with Monika Hilder, also a guest on The Plunge. Along with his continued participation in Inklings Institute events, he keeps busy writing stories for his grandchildren and their friends and singing in a choral group. Stephen is a writer of fiction, and his new series, The Perilous Times Saga, has debuted this year. It is available now, and there'll be a link if you'd like to explore in the show notes. And that book is entitled Susie and the Magic Turnip. Stephen and I have a wide-ranging conversation, as you would expect with a person with such diverse interest and deep understanding as Stephen provides. And I hope that you'll enjoy this episode as we discuss love and consciousness, the limits and boundaries of reality through the eyes of Charles Williams and Owen Barfield. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Stephen for being willing to take the plunge. I'm so excited to have Stephen Dunning back with us on The Plunge, a very notable scholar and becoming a good friend. Stephen, I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming a Charles Williams scholar, and also what are you up to these days?
Right. Well, I'm a bit atypical, I imagine, in the order in which I came to the Inklings, so I'll start there. I didn't read any of the Inklings when I was a child or even a young teenager. And the order I got to them was Tolkien first. The Lord of the Rings was the first thing I read. And then C.S. Lewis's Theology when I was probably 19, 18. And then Charles Williams. Unlike a lot of people who read the Inklings, I eventually did get to Charles Williams and then Owen Barfield later. So I went that whole route. But I'll just tell you a little bit about that. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was probably 16, and it just blew me away. I remember thinking that I would never read another book that would be as good. And I think I would still say many years later that's still probably true. I remember trying to explain the profound impact it had on me to my mother, and I was going on about it. I didn't really have a vocabulary to talk about it. And she looked up at me. She was working in the kitchen, and she looked up and she said, but it isn't true. And I didn't have the vocabulary to explain then, the sense in which it was true. Then I went through a conversion or reconversion as a teenager. I was 18. And then I started reading Lewis's theology books, Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, maybe Miracles or The Problem of Pain. I can't remember. But he became in many ways the father, my spiritual father, I would say, in many ways. And then my whole life was determined by a gift I got in the late 70s from friends of ours, friends of my wife and mine. They gave me this. I still have it. There it is.
Wow.
I still have, this is the 6th volume. It's pretty beat up. It doesn't even have a bottom. But that's the Erdmann's Charles Williams novels. And that's how I got into Charles Williams. And what happened was, it was at Christmas, and I was off. So I read all 6 in about a week. I'm not a super fast reader, but I had nothing else to do, and they just blew me away. I remember being called to my door and not being able to talk, not being able to even greet someone. So it just turned my world upside down. And it wasn't so much that I felt like I was going into a different world. It was that what Williams managed to do was to change my perception of my world. And that's an important thing I think we'll get to later. But anyway, in that experience, there was one of the novels. It was the fourth one that was published, and it's called Shadows of Ecstasy. Now, it didn't feel right. I remember just having this sense as I read it that it didn't even belong with the other novels, that it felt as if someone else had written it. And I couldn't shake that. That took quite a while to figure out what was going on. Anyway, a little bit later, I discovered that, in fact, it was his first novel, and it wasn't published until he done okay with the other ones, and then they were willing to publish it, and so that was interesting. So it wasn't his fourth, it was his first, and I thought, okay, well, what was going on then, and what happened in his authorship? And I discovered a little bit later, probably while I was working on my bachelor's degree, that Williams had joined, it's a mystical or occult order. It's called the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross. I'm sure that Laura and others would have mentioned it, but when he wrote, and he joined it in 1917. And when he wrote Shadows of Ecstasy, he was effectively running the place. Okay, so
Wow.
he was Magister Templi. His Latin name actually was Frater qui venit sitiat, the brother who comes thirsty, as I recall. Anyway, so that got me interested, and I thought, well, I need to do a bit more research here, because it struck me that the novel was exploring really whether Christianity was viable as compared to the occult order, and there are differences.
Okay.
And so I started thinking about that. And anyway, long story short, for my BA and my honors thesis, and my master's thesis, and my PhD, I really did nothing but try to figure out the crisis as I saw it, or the tension in Williams' authorship. And I really should just thank my indulgent and very good supervisors. David Jeffrey, who was the provost at Baylor later, he was my honors thesis and my master's thesis supervisor, in Glenn Cavaliero in Cambridge. And they allowed me to explore that. So I really spent 12 years trying to work that problem out. And it's actually quite useful, because it helps me sort through some of the things in Barfield too. There are differences, but there are some similarities. Here's an interesting similarity. The year that Williams got married, he joined the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross. That's 1917. The year Barfield got married, he joined the Anthroposophical Society, and his wife was not happy. Right, you probably know that she enlisted Lewis to try to talk him out of it, which resulted in what they called their Great War. Anyway, the other thing I should mention about about Charles Williams, was Bruce Cockburn. As I was reading the novels the first time, Cockburn had just released, I don't know if you know who Bruce Cockburn is. He's a Canadian, he's quite a well-known Canadian folk singer, artist, and he had just released an album called Dancing in the Dragon's Jaw. And I was listening to this over and over again as I was reading Charles Williams's novels. And I thought, they seem to fuse in my mind. And I thought, boy, that's interesting. And then I looked at the liner notes. And Cockburn said that some of the songs had been inspired by the writings of Charles Williams. So it was, whenever stuff like that happened, and it was purely fortuitous that I was doing this. And so when stuff like that happens, you should pay attention. So I paid attention. So that's sort of the story of how I became a Charles Williams scholar. It was really a gift of a box set of books and a dissatisfaction with one of the novels.
Oh, here's to relentless curiosity, right?
Yeah, I used to tell my students, when they were working on an essay topic, don't look at what you do know to write about. Try to find something that that puzzles you. Work on that. Mm-hmm. So I worked on it and ended up with a PhD. So that's kind of funny.
Fantastic. And
yeah.
You've served as a professor for a number of years. As my understanding, you're formally retired from that position now?
I am, and you asked what I've been up to, so I'll show you. So this, I'm not trying to plug it, I'm just trying to show you. This would be easy.
Oh, yeah.
So that's actually, it just got published. That's the first.
Wonderful.
I've actually written the whole trilogy. It's a young adult thing. And then I have to confess, I also write a thing about trolls under a pseudonym, because it's a branding thing, But anyway, and it's very funny. I have a good time. So basically, it's because of my grandkids, I told a lot of stories. So now now I've been writing young adult fiction. And I should just add one thing more about this. Remember one of our Inklings Institute meetings where they were talking about the heritage that the Inklings have. And I remember somebody said, to really be in the spirit of the Inklings is not to study necessarily the Inklings. It's to do what they did.
Right.
Which is right. And it's just that. So it's kind of interesting, right? And I thought, well, yeah, I can make a little contribution to that world. And so partly it was in response to that recognition that, that these authors responded to that need that they saw, and they wrote. So I think more people should do it, and I'm sure there are. I think Matthew Dickerson's an example of a Lewis scholar and Tolkien scholar, I think, who writes fantasy and so forth. But
that's wonderful.
Yeah,
well, I remember when we last spoke, you had shared the possible title for that book, so it's great to see it.
Yeah, it's Susie and the Magic Turnip, and which is a very silly title, but there you go.
That's great. It's great. Well, we're kindred spirits, so I'm playing my part. I'll plug.
Let's see.
That's Bryce and the Lost Pearl.
Oh, I like it. It looks.
Yeah, thank you.
Who did the cover design? Because it reminds me of the wing feather a bit. Like it's got the same style. Yeah,
got a little bit of similarity.
Yeah.
It's an artist. His name is George Ermos, Ermos. I've actually never met him.
Yeah.
The publisher made the connection, and he's based out of the UK, but I love his work, and the book has about a dozen interior illustrations.
Yeah, I can't afford that. Good
but
for
I'm
you.
looking forward to reading Susie and the Magic Turnip.
I think it's fun. It's a bit unusual, and I should mention that we're going to get to Barfield here in a minute. But Barfield plays quite a substantial part in this book, in the critique of modernism. And by the way, I should mention, I actually had the real pleasure of interviewing Owen Barfield, and so that was something I've really been blessed by.
Would you mind sharing just a bit of that?
Yeah. It was as part of my research. He was living in Kent at the time, and he would have been, so it would have been in 1986, and he died in 97 at 99. So, he would have been 80, late 80s. And I went and talked to him, and I explained what I was interested in, and he was quite funny. He said, well, and I can't do his accent, but he said, I don't think I have time to learn Danish, because I was talking about Kierkegaard. And he says, you really think he's the thing, do you? And so he said, I don't think I have time to learn Danish. And of course, I didn't know Danish, and I was still doing all this work on Kierkegaard. So that was kind of funny. I remember he served me a cup of rather questionable instant coffee, and I got to ask him about, Steiner, about Rudolf Steiner, because I just found it slightly incredible and literally not to be believed that he bought into that, because I'd read quite a bit of Steiner by this time, right? And I asked him, and he said, no, I think he's the real deal. And I mean, you see in Worlds Apart where they're going after the anthroposophist in the symposium, and he's saying, well, basically Steiner was an initiate who comes along once every 1,000 years. And they have comments where they say things like, for anthroposophists, Steiner was not so much a human being as a natural phenomenon. So it's a bizarre thing. And I asked him, but he said no. He said he couldn't dismiss him as being a crank. So But it's sobering to read some of the stuff, but I'll get into that later, I suppose.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
That's what I remember about talking to Owen Barfield. And he was very kind. He was very gracious.
Yes, I got that impression as well. Through the series, we've talked about Barfield's relationship with Cecil Harwood and C.S. Lewis, but in particular, I'd love to just discuss a little bit more of the relationship with Williams, obviously. Yeah. I'm curious just about Williams' background and his own major events or biography, kind of how he came to the place he arrived at.
Mm-hmm. Well, boy, he was very different from the other Inklings. The first thing is that his family really struggled under financial constraints. They never had a lot of money. He had one sister. When his father's Okay, he got a scholarship. He did well in school. He got a scholarship, and then his father's eyesight failed, and he had to drop the scholarship and work to support his family. So I think he did 1 year. Maybe he was in his second year of university and had to drop out, and he did. He supported his family. He got a job in the Methodist bookstore, and then after that, when they needed a reader at the Oxford University Press, he was hired by them, and he stayed there for his whole life. I mean, if you look at he didn't go to war like Lewis and Tolkien and even Barfield, although Barfield didn't get into the war, but he was involved in it. Things like that. Williams, I should mention, is about 10 years older than Barfield and Lewis. So he was born in 1886. So anyway, I believe. So what's interesting is that on the outside, his life would have seemed pretty boring. But boy, his life was, he had what you might describe as a rich interior life. And he had a way of sharing that with others. I'll just mention some of the things that I think were kind of important. Joining Oxford University Press, which we'll talk about later, how that affected him, that was important. He met his wife, Florence Conway, at a children's Christmas pageant at St. Albans Church. He had quite a long engagement and then married her in 1917. That was pretty big. Huge event, though, in 1917, as I mentioned, joined the Order of the Fraternity Cross, the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, I should say. Then, what else interesting? At the Oxford University Press, he met Phyllis Jones, and I'll talk about her in a minute because she was very important in his life. She worked at the press. I think he met her in 1926. Then he became the official coordinator for the first English translations of Kierkegaard in English language. It was published by Oxford University Press and Princeton at the same time, and he was the coordinating editor for the Oxford side. He probably gave I think I might have mentioned this in our last talk, but he probably gave the first lecture on Kierkegaard that was ever given in England at the City Literary Institute. He did this too. He taught at the City Literary Institute, which is sort of important. It was like an adult night school in London.
Okay.
And he met a lot of people. I think he taught Dylan Thomas, I think.
That's neat. Well, I was going to say that's a commonality with George MacDonald and A.J. Scott.
Yeah.
Teaching adults.
Yep.
In the evening. Anyway, continue, please.
So he did it in the 30s, and then in 39, I believe it was, or whenever Oxford University Press, which is odd. It's Amen House. They don't say Amen House. It's Amen House. Amen House moved to Oxford, which is weird, from London, to avoid the bombing. And it was at that time that really he was in much closer quarters to Lewis and company. And it was really when Lewis started to promote him. Lewis had almost arranged for him to have a master's degree from Oxford. I mean, he was lecturing on Milton, probably lecturing on Dante, and Lewis was really pushing him. But let me say a couple of things too about, he always had a sense that there was not enough money. It was a big deal for him. He used to argue that Shakespeare probably wrote so much because he needed the money, and that was his sense. So writing, and he wrote so much more than any of the other Inklings. I mean, they wrote next to nothing compared to him. I mean, novels and plays and reviews and biographies and, and on and on. He wrote a huge number of things. I would say, too, that the other thing to remember is that he probably didn't have a really posh Oxbridge accent. He's described as having a very, some say Cockney accent. I don't think that's probably exactly true, but certainly not an upper class accent like Lewis would have had and Tolkien and Barfield. So he was a bit of an outsider in that sense too. Let me see what else did I want to? Oh yeah, you asked about his background with the OUP and how that affected things.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it was so central to his life. I can't imagine Charles Williams having become like Charles Williams without that. Sorry, excuse me. The first thing that they did was they liked him. So they published some of his early poetry. He had 4 books of early poetry. And they basically supported him that way. So he got some recognition because of them. He also had this capacity. Well, first of all, I don't think he even worked. I get the sense that he did very little actual editing work, although that's not entirely true. So he probably had read everything that the Oxford Press published from about 19th century on. Of all the Inklings, he was probably the best read in modern literature because of his work.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing he did was edit a complete volume of Thackeray's works, which is a lot. And he also had a fabulous memory. It was saying that he could outquote most of them. So when he got around the Inklings. So that's the first thing. He gained a huge amount of experience with literature through his work at the press. But a lot of the time, I get the feeling that he kind of spent most of his time walking around to people's desks. He would always be writing. He had this little notepad that he used to write on, and he would cross his legs and he'd be writing on his leg. And his real gift, and the reason they liked him, was he had this way of generating, I suppose it would be a private mythology that he then invited other people into. And he created this atmosphere at the press where it was like they were living in some kind of holy drama. And he even wrote things for them to produce. He wrote one called The Mask of the Manuscript, where people at the press go through this whole series. It's a dramaturgy of the publication of a manuscript, and it had all the different departments and people. And he used to call people according to their... I mean, the head of Amen House, who was a knighted person, he was Sir Humphrey, he called him the Emperor, and he used to refer to him. And so he did cast a kind of spell over all the people there, and some of his closest friends came out of that work environment with him. And so he had that capacity for creating a sense of significance in everything. So nothing they did was without meaning. It was always, it was part of some larger vision that he shared, and that he would invite them to become part of.
So in a way, it sounds as though he, and this is a resonance for me of George MacDonald, when Chesterton says he's like a man returning home to fairyland, in that the things that are make-believe to the vast majority of the population were their actual reality from day to day.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, you do get that sense, and I'll talk about the different settings of the different Inklings and how it's different, but you've got it. I think that's very close, that it's like he lived in it.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just tell you this. T.S. Eliot, who later became his patron at Faber, right? He said that if he ever had to spend a night in a haunted house, there's only one person he'd want, and it would be Williams. And he said because Williams would know how to greet anybody or anything that showed up.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he was, I mean, the stuff that he wrote about, like in The Greater Trumps in the novels, and some of the things in the novels come out of his experience with the Rosy Cross, the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, and so forth. So
Right.
He was a little too well versed in that stuff, that's what I would say.
I'm curious about the idea of co-inherence, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, co-inherence, yep.
As a key part of his works. And is there a way to compare and contrast that idea with traditional Christian theology?
Oh yeah, I mean, co-inherence is based on the idea really of, it's grounded in the notion of God's immanence, okay, which is a standard theological doctrine. Christianity, goes along with paganism quite a ways. It argues God is present in the world, but it also insists that God is also transparent. There's an otherness to God, which you don't get in paganism, which I think is kind of important. Or if it's not the same kind of otherness. God, there are aspects of God that are unknowable. And I think that's sort of important. So let's just start with that. So co-inherence is based on the idea of God's presence. And the notion of co-inherence means that things live in and from each other. Okay? So Williams sometimes uses the doctrine of the Trinity as a kind of model. If we think about the way that the persons of the Trinity live together, that's a model or an analogy of how everything in our world also lives together. And it's really grounded in God's presence. So co-inherence is the idea that everything lives in and from each other, and that in a way it is like the relationship of the Trinity, and it also, I think one could say, derives from the Trinity in the sense that it is the divine which is the matrix within which everything exists. That's why when Williams talks about salvation, he's got an essay called Natural Goodness, And he says there that when God saved the world, he didn't come from the outside and do something to it in the sense of operating from the outside, but that he planted himself and something in the heart of it as a kind of natural growth.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of, so co-inherence, that's what it means. Now, the doctrine that you didn't ask about, but it was very important to Williams, was the idea of substitution. Because everything is grounded in God, and because there is a commandment that says to bear one another's burdens, well, Williams took this actually literally, and particularly it had to do with bearing people's fears, for example, or anxieties. And you can see this playing out in the novel Descent into Hell, where the poet Stanhope offers to carry Pauline's, the character in the novel, fear. She's a terrible, incapacitating fear because she keeps seeing this, her own doppelganger, and it terrifies her. And by the way, Stanhope, this is very typical of Williams too. Stanhope was the name under which Williams wrote some of his poetry. So he appears as characters in his own works quite often. That's typical Williams. So substitution was this idea that people could literally, because we're all grounded in the same thing, you could think it's not that we're completely interchangeable, although there is that philosophical problem. He takes the notion of individuality as a fact. We're all individuals. But if we're grounded in God, and God is the thing that ties everything together, and if we can literally bear each other's burdens through acts of imagination, then in a way I can see that there might be some problems in how individuality comes about. By the way, C.S. Lewis practiced this. He did try to carry, I think, some of his wife's fears later, and pain and things like that. So that was something that stuck, that Lewis clearly believed that it could be done as well. So that's interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's co-inherence.
Yeah.
And substitution. That's at the heart of a lot of Williams stuff.
Well, that's beautiful. Before we jump into Barfield, that ties into my next question, actually, especially since you brought up Lewis. Charles Williams, as I understand it, was fascinated by the intersection of human love and the divine. And you mentioned Descent into Hell and bearing one another's burdens quite literally, particularly fear and anxiety.
Yeah.
That makes, I guess that's something that I feel a call to. And I'm curious as to any differentiation in the understanding of love itself from Williams to the other Inklings or Lewis or any of the others.
Okay, Williams is absolutely eccentric to all of them.
Good.
I don't think there's much intersection. Let me just tell you a story about Barfield. Barfield, when he was younger, he fell in love with a girl who rejected him, right? So he was all devastated, and he went over to Europe, and he was sitting outside in some place in probably Switzerland or some place in the Alps maybe, and he had this realization that anything he was looking for in her, he could find in nature, and he felt better, and he gave that up. Now, for Williams, romantic love, that is the experience that the lover has of the beloved. It's the central thing in his authorship. It was the central thing in his life. There was nothing that's more important. His magnum opus as a work of literary criticism is the figure of Beatrice, where he looks at La Vita Nova, the new life, where Dante talks about meeting Beatrice, or Beatrice, but we'll say Beatrice. And he talks about how that changed everything. It was like he was encountering Christ. Well, Williams had that experience in his own life. And he treats the whole of the Divine Comedy, all the levels of hell, purgatory, and heaven, but hell particularly, as failures of love. Okay? Everyone is a failure of love. And for Lewis talks about the four kinds of love, right? He talks about, Williams does not distinguish. For him, there is no distinction between caritas and eros. And that really bothered a few theologians, because he doesn't. Sure. You're in love, you're in love. That's what Williams would say. I try to explain this to students like this, because almost everyone will have had this experience. If you've ever been in love, you know the way that you can idealize, or that the lover or the beloved can appear, idealized. Let's put it that way. Now, what Williams would say is, that's what you're seeing is either true or it isn't. Now, if you're an evolutionary biologist, your answer is, look, getting love, like mating with someone and being willing to take up the duties of child rearing. That's the kind of thing you have to get tricked into, because this is for guys particularly, right? Because no one in their right mind is going to want to do this. So we've developed this this biological mechanism and hormones that that screw up our minds and make us want to be with people. Well, it's interesting. Some cultures treat being in love as a kind of mental illness, and they'll actually sequester people until they get over it. But anyway, but for Williams, this is the question he says. He says it's either true or it isn't. And he says, if it's true, and he answers it is true. He says, well, what does that mean? It means that what you are seeing in the beloved is their capacity for glory and beatitude. So what you're seeing, in fact, is a higher reality, not a lower one. And that what that awakens in turn in you is your capacity for glory. And so that's kind of interesting. So for him, there's nothing more important. There's no way that's closer to getting to God, and there's nothing that's more demanding. Now, at one point, he actually takes the gospel stories and he treats it as a love affair. And so Judas is the one who betrays love. And I should explain in Williams's own life, this is going to seem a little unseemly perhaps to some of our listeners, but it is a fact about him that needs to be talked about. He fell hard for his own wife, and he wrote lots of stuff for her. But at work, he ran into a woman named Phyllis Jones. This is the one I mentioned before. This would have been many years after he'd met his wife. And they had an unconsummated relationship, but he was in love, and he wrote all kinds of poetry and things for her. And Gerard Hopkins, who was Gerard Manley Hopkins' nephew, worked with Williams. He went to Williams's wife and told her about what was going on. And I guess basically Williams then entered a state of hell at work and hell at home. It wasn't very, very good. Anyway, and she later dated Gerard Williams. And so you can think about Williams. He's still head over, like he's idealized her, perfectly.
Yes.
And yet here she is. I don't know what she wanted from Williams, but it probably wasn't whatever he was offering, whatever that was. And Gerard, she dates him for a while, and then she meets somebody else, and she goes off to some place on the other side of the world. I think it was Polu. It was someplace in Malaysia or something like that. But anyway, this insight that Williams has, as he saw her betrayal of love, he saw as what he called the impossibility. And because the beloved, so I'm going to give you another one of his aphorisms. It's, this also is thou, neither is this thou. That is one of the key concepts in Williams. So, and he's talking about God. So this also is thou, but neither is this thou. And he puts a semicolon in between it so that it turns on it. Anyway, there's a line from Troilus and Cressida that he loved, and it's something like, I think it says, this is not my Cressida. It's Troilus when he believes that she's betrayed him. But Williams believed that a person like that, he could have said it of Phyllis Jones, that this is Phyllis Jones, but this is not my Phyllis Jones. And so there was this duality that he sensed where people could betray the glory they were called to. Now, he was pretty consistent. He has this line in Figure of Beatrice where he's talking about Dante. And I don't know if you know this, but Dante, at one point, he looked up at some lady in Florence who was looking out a window, and Beatrice heard about it, and he had dedicated a lot of stuff to Beatrice. And as soon as he meets her in heaven or purgatory, she reams him out for betraying her flesh by looking at this other woman. So in the Figure of Beatrice, Williams has a footnote where he talks about the second image of love. So if you fall in love again. And he says, he has this insane footnote. You can just imagine his wife thinking about this, right? Where he says, if the lover and his original love could gaze together in admiration at the glory of the new beloved, doing it together, things would just work out basically hunky-dory. It's insane. It's like, I can't imagine anything less likely.
Right.
So Florence, his wife, called, what did he call? Oh, yeah, I think she called Phyllis Jones the Virgin Tart or something like that. Anyway, it was a mess. I mean, but he tried, but I'll give Williams this credit, is he tried to live in that. And he took really seriously that idea that when you are in love, it is God that you are in, and that what you see must be true. And then you are required to live your life according to those lights. And he tried. He tried.
Yeah.
It made him almost half mad, I think, because he got him. I mean, what do you do when the person you think is, the image of God is running off to some place with some other guy?
Right.
I think
Yeah, all of the sort of temptations aside, I do think he's touching on something very important. And the reason that I bring it up, or the reason I reinforce it, is in my own sort of passionate devotion to the work of George MacDonald, I think often of his quote regarding love, that love is one and love is changeless, and that love has ever in view the absolute loveliness of that which it beholds.
Yep.
Right? And
but that's God looking at, you see.
Correct.
What Williams does is turns it around and saying that we're in love looking at the other, right?
Right.
Yeah,
I think
but I agree, it's the same thing. I agree.
Yeah, and when you say the term idealized, right, that we're all familiar with that.
Yeah.
I would maybe suggest that for Williams, his term for that would be actualized.
Yeah, well, this is what's really interesting, because this is where Williams runs into lots of difficulties. And it's something, by the way, that Barfield criticizes his theology about. And this is what it is. When you see the beloved, you are not seeing it actualized. You are seeing the potential and experiencing it as if it is actualized. Mm-hmm. But it isn't. Mm-hmm. It actually needs to be actualized in time.
Right.
But the aesthetic experience, or the romantic experience, gives the person a sense of its completion with a tremendous foreshortening of time and process. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's process that Williams really chafed under. Like really chafed under.
That makes sense.
But anyway, but you're right. There is I don't know, maybe you're using actualized in a slightly different sense. I didn't mean to correct you. It's just that.
No. I think I tend to suffer from some of those same romanticized notions of seeing the end before we've gotten there.
Yeah. Well, I'm like that too. I mean, the only reason why anyone would read Charles Williams and allow yourself to fall under his spell after a while is because he offers such a compelling vision. Yeah. But it is a vision. This is why Kierkegaard later was so important as a kind of corrective to that tendency, because Kierkegaard doesn't deny, as we talked about this before, he doesn't deny the validity of the aesthetic experience. He just says you have to actualize it in time, and that's not as much fun.
Not at all.
It's like, I really like worshiping the beloved, but man, she's annoying. She snores and I have to make her coffee and tea, and she always criticizes me, and I'm never...
Right.
There it goes.
I suppose the one counterpoint would be that if the vision is compelling enough, the endurance is there.
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting too. Yeah, that's exactly right. Without the vision...
Right.
There's no awakening. And it's interesting that within the occult order that Williams joined, it was run by a Christian mystic. I don't know. Did Laura get into any of the stuff? She probably didn't. Okay. Well, I need to talk about this then. A.E. Waite was the founder of the order that Williams was in. Now, A.E. Waite had become a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn in London, the same one that U.B. Yeats was a member of. And Yeats and Waite had a big contest. Basically, Yeats wanted to practice magic. Like, Waite wanted to talk about Christian mysticism, and he wanted to rewrite the ceremonies to get rid of it. So that's kind of interesting. So there was a big fallout between those two. So Waite basically split off. But here's one of the things that Waite said, and that Williams, I think, clearly adopted, is that without the experience of falling in love, there's no awakening. That it awakens people to their own capacity. for something. And he would also include high aesthetic experience. So it could be music, it could be art, but falling in love, because in a way you do fall in love with those things. There's a kind of beauty. So I think that Williams had experienced it himself, and so that when he ran into Waite, I think he recognized that here was someone who'd worked out a system, right? And that was based on that. Very similar to the way Barfield had worked out his thing, like his ideas of language and poetic diction. So when he ran into Steiner's, it seemed to mesh, right? It seemed to go farther. So I think there's that. But the falling in love thing is huge. And you're right. It's a kind of awakening. And it's the motivation, because if you can remember, right, it's the memory. And if you can remember that, like for Williams, if something is true, it's always true.
Yes.
It doesn't stop being true.
Right. I love that.
Yeah.
If it's okay, we'll jump into Williams and Barfield's interactions.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
My first question is...
I have no idea where I am in my lists here.
Well, in your notes, we're in number 6.
Oh my goodness. Oh no, haven't we done the novels yet?
Oh, well, let's touch on those. I just want to be mindful of your time.
Oh no, I'm fine. I'm happy. I'll
talk.
I'm really happy to talk about this stuff.
Great.
This is my life. Like what you're getting here is like my life. How sad. But anyway, there we go.
No, not sad at all. This is invigorating for me.
Good.
And I think as we continue on this journey of building out this content, I'm finding lots of people reaching out and being inspired in their own quest. Us eccentrics have to stick together. And the internet helps us find one another.
Yeah. Yes. That's a good thing, I think, generally.
Yes.
Okay, so novels. Let's hear this.
Yeah. His novels, they blend supernatural and theological elements into contemporary settings. And I'm curious, as obviously Tolkien in particular, his mythopoeic world, Middle Earth, and then Narnia with Lewis and Paralandra. What do you see as differences there and the techniques Williams uses?
Okay, great question. In fact, that's whenever I teach any new work or author within a fantasy genre, one of the first things is you have to look at the relationship of the fantasy world to what we call our world, to reality. Okay? Now, in Tolkien, what he effectively does is he recreates, it's a sub-creation, but it's not completely independent, sticking pretty close to the ethos of Northern European mythology, right? That's what he builds. He builds that world, and his knowledge of language allows him to do that. So in a sense, it's the past. And you'll notice that one of the things Tolkien does, because he uses hobbits, and this I can't claim, this is from Thomas Shippey, I think is his name. He made this argument.
I've read his biography.
Yeah, it's exactly right, by the way, what he says about what Tolkien does. What Tolkien does is he takes a modern bourgeois character, who's actually the Hobbit, whether it's Frodo or Bilbo, and he takes him out of the contemporary world and leads him into the world of epic. And you can see how Gandalf does that. He says, that shields are now used for covering up food dishes and swords are doing something else. But he has to go back. So essentially, we go with Bilbo, because we can identify more with his sensibilities. We go to the past and we come back. But we're changed by it, right? It's there and back again. So it's really a journey in time from our modern world back to an epic world. It's wonderful. Lewis does something, so that's a journey in time, I would say. Lewis does something in space. There's always these transitions. Narnia is this place that's other than our world. Now, there are points of transition and where they can move between. What's fascinating is, that Tolkien and Lewis at one time agreed to Tolkien said he was going to write something about time travel. Lewis said he was going to do space travel. Well, Lewis gave us the space trilogy. Tolkien got started. But in a way, I think The Lord of the Rings particularly is his story of time travel. So I think he did it in the end. So space and time, and I think that's the two of them. What Williams does is something really a lot different than that. What Williams does is he shows that our world does not include the supernatural so much as the supernatural includes our world. And it's like, do you remember that time? I think it was Elijah or Elisha. and he's all bummed out because he thinks that they're going to lose the battle the next day, and God just peels back this veil so we can see. Well, that's what Williams does. Williams just peels back the veil. And it's interesting. That's one of the lines that Bruce Cockburn used. He's a very good poet in his songwriting, and he talks about pulling back the veil or piercing the darkness to show it full of blinding light. And that's what Williams does. He changes absolutely our understanding of what reality is. And so that's the first thing. Now, the way he does it is quite interesting. In many of the early novels, there'll be objects like the chalice or the Holy Grail, the stone in the crown of Solomon, there'll be the tarot deck, there can be Platonic archetypes in the place of the lion. That, by the way, was the book that Lewis really loved, and their letters crossed in the mail. And then later on it becomes aesthetic objects. In Descent into Hell, the organizing thing, the supernatural thing, is the play that Stanhope writes. And in the All Hallows Eve, it's really a painting that seems to reveal something. So first of all, he finds symbols of the divine, and he concentrates, so the divine becomes concentrated in the symbol, and they serve as touchstones for the characters, because the way the characters relate to these things shows their disposition towards the supernatural. Mm-hmm. It's a very useful, actually, strategy.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what he does. So he's very different. You don't have to go anywhere with Williams to discover like the supernatural. And by the way, I should say in the little books I'm trying to write, I'm trying to show that that's the case, because I'd much rather show that our world is probably more like Williams's, not with all the magic and things like that, but that our world isn't what we have been told it is by modernity. It just simply isn't. Mm-hmm. That there's a lot more going on. So I like what Williams does, and I think that it's something it's difficult to emulate, because we tend to want to travel somewhere, go somewhere. But the books I like the best, the fantasies I like the best, are always the ones that show what's in our world, or what we're in, and where those two are, where there's overlap. So I think really,
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I really like that idea that our world is within that world.
Yeah.
I think that is more accurate.
Well, you're going to like this. Do you know what Barfield says about space? Okay, so he talks about the mechanomorphic science, right? He talks about Newton, and he says we had to create our notion of space to be able to have physics, right? Uh-huh. But he says it's actually a product of a certain kind of understanding. His real argument is that consciousness does not exist in space. He wants to say space exists in consciousness.
Wow, that's heavy.
Yeah. Oh, Barfield is, I like, my students will read Barfield and they just don't understand how absolutely earth-shattering it is. I'm just going to tell a quick story about Barfield's status, because I know we want to get to Barfield, right?
Yes.
Okay. Harold Bloom once did an interview, and you can maybe find this on YouTube. I've watched it. A friend sent it to me ages ago. Harold Bloom was a Fulbright scholar at Cambridge when Lewis was at Cambridge, and they famously did not get along. Now, Harold Bloom made a lot more of it than Lewis did, probably just to gain a kind of status as a rebel. But anyway, he dissed Tolkien and he dissed Lewis, and he went off on this. And then he says, but there was one of those guys, a friend of C.S. Lewis, he said, who was a true, incredible genius, and he said Owen Barfield. And so you get, now I'm not sure that an endorsement by Harold Bloom is what everybody wants, but anyway, there you go.
That's neat.
But anyway, he certainly had that sense of his status. And Barfield really is, what he is proposing, as you say, it's heavy. It's absolutely counterintuitive to everything that we think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, Williams and Barfield.
Okay.
Both of them were deeply concerned with the nature of reality and perception, and I'm curious about a comparison of their ideas. Final participation for Barfield and Williams' co-inherence.
Did you want to find out about how they met and what interaction they had first?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it was probably at Lewis's encouragement, but Williams, I think he probably helped them set up a get-together. So Williams didn't know much about Barfield, but he wanted to meet him because he was a friend of Lewis. So Williams shows up at the restaurant, and this is typical Williams, and he's just yakking away 100 miles an hour. And he says to Barfield, "Did you know somebody just accused me of being an anthropologist?" And he didn't know that Barfield was a disciple of Steiner. So that's how they met. Now, and they didn't have much to do with each other, and they didn't influence each other at all. Both were absolutely fully developed, by the time they met. But they did have some relationship to each other. Just before he died, Williams reviewed Barfield's Romanticism Comes of Age, okay? And whereas Barfield reviewed Descent into Hell. And what's so funny is, I don't know, anyway, it was just weird because they talked right past each other, particularly Williams, and I think this was typical. He wrote so many reviews. He probably didn't, I don't even know how often or how carefully he read the books. But something about Barfield's book really annoyed him because it was talking about Coleridge and then anthroposophy. And for Williams, if you look at all his writing, Reason and Beauty in the Poetic Mind, and a whole bunch of others, he basically argued that Wordsworth was the only English romantic worth talking about. And he goes off on how, the book hadn't talked about Wordsworth. It had nothing to do with, he wasn't trying to talk about Wordsworth. He was trying to talk about Coleridge. So anyway, he went off. And you can almost hear, Williams saying, "Look, if you'd read my books on the figure of Beatrice and so forth, you wouldn't need to be asking all these silly questions," or you get that tone. Whereas Barfield read Descent into Hell very carefully, and he said that he disagreed with, and this is a consistent criticism he had of Williams' theology, he didn't like it in the book when Stanhope's substitution, willingness to carry Pauline Spear, was retroactive. And he mentions in Saving the Appearances that he didn't like the fact that Williams made the effects of the incarnation retroactive. For Barfield, time is linear. For him, process is everything. You don't start going backwards. And so that was his big criticism. And he really pointed out, I think very astutely, Williams chafing under time and not liking process and wanting to leap immediately from the temporal to the eternal. And that really is Williams. But so that's their connection. They really didn't influence each other. They seemed to like each other. And Barfield did say that he thought that there were areas where they could find common ground if they'd had a chance to talk. But they never did get that chance. And I have some ideas about what that might be. But let's go talk about the theology here.
Sure. Well, I'm curious about Williams' mystical approach to theology and any overlap with Barfield's interest in anthroposophy and the evolution of consciousness.
Okay. I think what I just said is not a bad segue into this. For Barfield, okay, I'll just give you the schemata of, very briefly, what Barfield's evolution of consciousness. Because if we can get this basic idea, then I think that we can understand just how different his imagination is from Williams's. Okay, so for Barfield, essentially humanity goes from what he calls original participation, and I'll talk about that in a minute, through to the current state, which really was at its peak probably during actually the 19th century, but it actually produced science. And then there's a further stage he imagines, which we might be at the beginning of now, called final participation. Essentially, this is what happened. Oh yeah, and the other thing you have to remember is there is no consciousness without phenomena, and no phenomena without consciousness. In fact, he says that nature emerges when we first start speaking, that nature and language emerge together. And you get that echoes of that in Eden, right, where Adam names the animals. You get that sense of, although there are differences, obviously. So anyway, so what does this mean? Well, if you go back far enough, what Barfield claims is there's a point at which what is happening in nature and in man is indistinguishable. Nature and man are one. You can't distinguish between the two. Over time, there's this kind of splitting of a unity into a subjective pole and an objective pole. So you get the I, okay, on one side, the self, the perceiving self, and you get phenomena on the other. So you get consciousness, self-consciousness. Now, through the early pagan times and even in medieval times, there's a sense in which the self, but the idea of the porous self, it's something Charles Taylor talks about this in A Secular Age, where he says for the medievals, they had a porous self. They were hugely influenced by the things around them. The self wasn't buffered, he calls,
Right,
but it's really
right.
right. It's exactly out of Barfield. And he never cites, which I think is kind of rude. But anyway, so eventually the poles get so far apart between the self and the objects out there that we forget that they're connected. Because in original participation, this is what happens. Human beings sense that out there and behind the phenomena and inside us is the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's super sensible. It connects it. So we participate in the objects, but we're both participating in the divine. So this is why it's actually original participation that's closest to Williams's idea of co-inherence. So that's an interesting connection.
Interesting.
But what Barfield says is that's paganism. Okay? So I think
Williams is a pagan to Barfield.
I would actually say that there's some truth in that. And I think that's why Kierkegaard was so therapeutic for Williams, because he really insisted on the difference between Christianity and paganism. He wanted to emphasize the discontinuity. But anyway, so what happens at the height of the scientific revolution is that we've forgotten that there's a link between us, and even by severing the link, we've produced the things that we take as given. So for Barfield, there is no history of phenomena. You can't talk about a solid world that existed before human beings. Okay, there was no world. So for Barfield, it's not that our story, and he calls it mechanomorphic idols smashing against idols, that they've been banging into each other for a couple of billion years, and then, woohoo, magically they produce consciousness. For Barfield, it's that consciousness actually produces eventually the separation between the subject and the object. And that we experience things as unparticipated, that this is where contemporary physics, he makes, especially in Saving the Appearances, Barfield makes a big deal out of this, because there is the observer problem, right? That you cannot know both, say, position and velocity of a particle. Mm-hmm. And by testing it, you determine it. Same thing that happens with light when you look at wave function and particle function and so forth. So physics has actually run into the recognition that we do participate, whatever that reality is at that level. But what Barfield always wants to claim is we forget that we also participate in the world. Barfield says that what the pagans recognized is that what we see represented in the world is us. It's not something alien. It is, in fact, we're seeing whatever is common to us, and it is what's out there. So Barfield says that even now, listen to this craziness. He says that nature is our unconscious.
Because of how we've separated ourselves from it.
Yeah. And so the goal for Barfield is to make it more conscious. So essentially, the incarnation comes into all this. Another way to think about it is in terms of, I'll do it in terms of meaning, and I'll do it in terms of the divine. In paganism, in the original participation, the meaning is out there, the divine is out there, it's in the world. It's also in us, but it's essentially out there too. It all gets contracted into modernism, and there's nothing inside or outside. So meaning becomes a huge problem. With final participation, there's now no meaning outside. Any meaning that we're going to provide is going to come from inside. So there is no God out there underscoring what's going to happen. And that's huge, underwriting it. So, and he quotes Coleridge in one place. He says, we get from nature what we bring to it through our imagination. Barfield, by the way, wrote a wonderful book on Coleridge called What Coleridge Thought. I've talked to some Coleridge scholars who say it's one of the top books it's written. So he really understood Coleridge very well. He's a very good critic. Anyway, so this is the world, that there was no time. And actually, Barfield's kind of interesting because in philosophy, there's a thing called the hard problem. I don't know if you're familiar with this term. Okay. No. The hard problem is the problem of consciousness. How on earth did we get consciousness out of unconsciousness, right? And I don't think it can be done. Now, there's a guy named Nagels, I think Thomas Nagels. He wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, and the subtitle is Why the Neo-Darwinian Account of Consciousness is Almost Certainly Wrong, or something like that. Now, he's not a believer, and he is a Neo-Darwinian, but he says there is no way that you can account for consciousness in a Darwinian model. If you don't start with consciousness, you don't end up with consciousness. And so there are a number of people now who are starting to, cosmologists and anthropologists and philosophers, there's panpsychism and there's a few other kinds of things, but they're recognizing that consciousness has to be there from the beginning. Now, if you don't believe in the transcendent, right, consciousness has to be in everything. But anyway, so it takes care of the hard problem. And the other thing is that, I mean, just this fact that we think that consciousness, that all our consciousness is located inside our skull, so for Barfield, he says, of course not. I mean,
Right.
it's just that, so that's kind of the evolution of consciousness. Just remember, no phenomena without consciousness. And as consciousness evolves, so do phenomena. As phenomena evolve, so does consciousness. And so does language. This is why basically Barfield detected this, because through his studies in language, he saw that what we would see as inner things and outer things, if you go back far enough in language, and you can trace this etymologically, that there's no distinction. They didn't distinguish between wind and spirit, for example.
Right.
They just didn't.
Right.
Later, because we have this separation where we don't participate things, now the spirit is inside and the wind's just out there. The spirit means something, but the wind doesn't mean anything. And in fact, that's one of the exercises. I think that anthroposophist that you cited talked about the exercises they do with wind and the spirit, but that's just one example. And Barfield is undoubtedly right that language shows that our experience of the world and of phenomena has changed. Now, Charles Taylor, who's probably Canada's best known philosopher, in Secular Age again, he says, the current scientific narrative is this: all the pagans and previous people were wrong. That our view, the scientific view, is the right one. Matter's just matter. There's only primary qualities out there. And so that what science does is it's stripping away the accretions of superstition till you get down to the bare facts. He calls it a subtraction narrative. And I think we've bought into this. What Barfield says is no. The way that they saw the world in a way that was absolutely legitimate, that's the way the world was. Barfield has this beautiful statement where he says, for ancient peoples, nature was something that man wore as a cloak, not really a stage we walked around on. Wearing nature as a cloak. Just think about that. So anyway, it's very radical. I mean, you try to get your head around that. And dinosaurs. So everybody always goes, what do you do with the dinosaur bones? Well, he says humans weren't all, he says, you're not going to find human bones because when the dinosaurs were around, humans weren't at the stage where they had bones. And he also thinks that the elements change. So anyway, he has a view of, he's evolutionary, but you notice that's a big difference between Williams and Barfield. Barfield is very evolutionary, very linear. He does think we can get to a paradisal end through this final participation. Now, what does final participation means? It means that because there is nothing out there that it gives meaning, and because we're providing it, he also says that we have the capacity, or will have the capacity, to shape reality through the imagination, okay? So, and he actually says at one point that we'll be able to create mountains where they weren't there before. So on the one hand, we've got our tectonic plates and geological things and all that stuff going on that's taking care of all this stuff. And then you get Barfield who says, no. So, I mean, he's pretty radical, right? I mean, it runs so against. I don't even remember what you asked me, but.
No, that you nailed it. But just talking about that idea of final participation with respect to their different approaches to our reality. The thing that I've always believed, I don't know where I picked it up, maybe I intuited it, but the idea, as you mentioned, that we've reduced it to where just whatever's in our brain is what we concoct, maybe the chemical connections create these things. It seems implausible to me to ignore the entirety of the body as a sensing, processing organism. right? So every element of our being in the natural domain is coupled with whatever it is in the supernatural or the spiritual domain.
That's called the doctrine of correspondence, eh? You know that?
No, tell
It's
me about
called
that.
there's a thing that, well, the medievals certainly believe this. It's called the Smaragdine maximum, as above so below. And the
Right.
medieval mind, if you look at bestiaries and lapidaries and all those things, for the medievals, working with the chain of being within the different kingdoms, everything corresponds to something else, right up into the heavenly hierarchies, as you're saying. And the body itself is also a kind of index of that. Barfield says at one point that the human body is the most profound symbol in the universe. Now that is where Williams picked up on that, because Williams thought that the body was an index to reality. And it goes back to, I'm not going to encourage your readers to check it out, but if they want, it's called the Sephirotic tree. It's basically fundamental to Kabbalistic Judaism.
Huh?
And it shows the universe in the structure of a man, hands out like this, and there are 10 stations. There's some in the middle and at each arm and so forth. One side is darker. One side is light. In the middle is the way of benignity, where they cancel each other out. So, and I checked, I was interested in this. Steiner himself used the tree and the Sephiroth for anthroposophy too. So that idea of a duality, and in fact the FRC, Williams's group, practiced the mystical ascent of the Sephirotic tree, which is about correspondences, talking about, right? That was part of their practices, was that mystical ascent of the tree. But the body as the most profound symbol of everything. So that's kind of interesting.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Anyway.
Since you mentioned that symbolism, what do you make of their view on the nature of words, myth, and images?
Wow. Okay. So now it's interesting. There are obviously similarities in that both take language extremely seriously. Williams is let's start with Barfield. Barfield, as I said, he argues that with the emergence of language comes the emergence of phenomena, comes the emergence of nature, basically. So language is at the heart. Language is the way we understand and name. He says something really amazing. He says that language is the thing that creates the distance we need between us and whatever's out there. It's a distancing thing as well as connecting. And by the way, I've created a mishap. I have to go back and just say one more thing about the movement, the evolution of consciousness. For Barfield, you need the creation of these idols, these unparticipated scientific things. You need it. He calls it scouring out the residue of paganism, so that we are free of that, because he notes that in paganism, a lot of the orgiastic celebrations were violent and not particularly pleasant, and that it was a way of expressing the life force, but it was also tied up with death. And you could think of Bacchanalia, because the celebration of that life force that the pagans, so for him, moving through, out of that is really important. The other thing it gives us is that is how individuality emerges. Because we cannot be separated from nature if we're being pushed around and operated through. So it's a good thing. It's a necessary thing. But if final participation doesn't kick in, then we're lost. We have no meaning. Because the end of it is the loss of meaning.
Sure.
Anyway, I just had to go back.
That makes sense.
Okay, so what did you ask me about? Sorry.
Just the way they thought about language, myth, images.
So language is essential for Barfield in the creation of the world, in the development of consciousness. Williams is in a long tradition of magician poets. Virgil, for example, was considered a magician as well as a poet.
Would that have any connection to alchemy? When you use the word magician?
I don't know enough about that to comment on that, but I would say that I'll just give you an example. I'll give it from one of his poems. It's called Mount Baden. It's one of Williams's poems. Taliesin is King Arthur's poet. King Arthur is engaged in a battle against pirates, pagan pirates, essentially. Taliesin is in charge of the king's horse. But what is Taliesin doing? He's sitting up on a hill, watching the battle, and he's writing. And as Taliesin is writing, he's got an image of Virgil behind him. And starts imagining Virgil. He talks about Virgil's hexameter forming, creating, right? Creating order out of chaos. And as he imagines Virgil doing it, he sees how he can write and how their forces can defeat the pagans, the chaotic forces. And I mean, I could read it to you, but I don't want to take. But it shows that poetry has this tremendous capacity to shape reality, language, and particularly for him, it's poetry, right? Not just any language, but that real poetry. Yeah, it is reality shaping, and there's a magical tradition behind that. And Williams, because I mean, to spell something is to spell,
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
So it's quite different, right? Williams does not have a doctrine of the evolution of consciousness that's tied to language, but he certainly has an understanding of language as profoundly important, especially
Yes.
poetry. He treats poetry the same way he treats scripture, and he
Yes.
accords it just about the same authority.
Yeah, well, when you mentioned poetry, obviously it was the highest form of expression, I think Barfield believed.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think to your connection to magic or spells, when we encounter a transcendent work of poetry, it does cast a spell on us. It does capture us and even take us away and compel us, not in a, I think so often as was portrayed in film or modern storytelling, like you're summoned to do something and you have no will to resist it. But I think of poetry as something that enlivens you to awaken a desire to do the thing that you probably could have or should have been doing.
Absolutely.
It's a little nuanced separation there.
It's perfect. Said
Yeah.
perfectly. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Completely. Yeah, that's it, exactly. And Williams says as much in many places. He also argues that poetry is more honest than prose. He says prose pretends that it can, but he says poetry, by being artificial, is acknowledging that it's a creation of humans and that there's something. And he's saying that we are deciding to have it thus, but you're right, that it does. There's a sense in which Williams does believe that it can act on a passive receiver audience, something, and it does shape, and you're exactly right. What it shapes is a potential, and it awakens people to that sense of the potential. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But
Beautiful.
but that's a temptation, right?
Sure.
Because you can be, instead of, it's like Lewis, with on Voyage to Venus, where we can ask for the same thing again and again and again. We could want a hit instead of actually doing what it's for, because poetry is actually for the actualizing of it later, right? It's the living it out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess kind of the last question I've got is Williams and Barfield, again, you mentioned earlier they had limited interaction. I'm just curious about their engagement with each other's work, and you hinted at maybe some thoughts you had about their own way they might have thought about each other.
Yeah. I think that where their thoughts overlap the most is in the duality that certainly there in the polarity of Barfield's thought and in the polarity of Williams's ideas of co-inherence. But I just want to point out that Williams gets himself in lots of trouble when he starts thinking about evil, because there is an implication in the Sephirotic tree that darkness is at least a part of God. Okay? And if you read something like Williams' essay, What the Cross Means to Me, he says that when Christ is on the cross and he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That becomes an experience within the Trinity. That is, in a sense, the terrible sense of division that becomes part of God's experience. And the biggest difference between and this is where I think they wouldn't have agreed, the biggest difference between Williams and Barfield is that Barfield was fearless or foolish in this sense, that he actually has a kind of manifesto that says what is required of an anthroposophist scientist. Okay, let me see if I can get this right. Absolutely open-minded, absolutely objective, no personal bias, fearless and willing to think any thought to the end. Williams? No. Williams actually says in a whole bunch of places, I stand corrected by the teachings of the church. Barfield did not care about orthodoxy. It meant nothing to him. absolutely nothing. And you can see that quite clearly if you look at, what he subscribes to. I don't know if you've talked about this, but the two Jesus heresy, the, reincarnation, and all the rest, lots of bizarre stuff. But he didn't care. Didn't mean anything. Whereas Williams really does. He's got this one line in a letter where he says, "They've never proved me heretical yet." And it mattered to him. So I think that their imaginations were shaped by a kind of duality. I would say Williams's imagination is darker than if he was aware of more suffering than Barfield. Barfield seems pretty what you'd call psychologically healthy. I would say Williams really struggled with darkness, right? But anyway, but what Williams does is he will not go beyond the bounds of orthodoxy, which is why, even though his imagination pushed him, especially the idea of the duality in things pushed him. And that's why Lewis endorsed Williams and rejected almost completely Barfield's position. And it's not because at root they were that different in their imagination, but it's because Williams says in one place, he says, that unfettered interior or personal illumination is a disaster. It's chaos. He was afraid of it, right? He recognized that there was danger and that there were limits and that the church had the right and the duty to put limits on these things. Barfield, it meant nothing to Barfield at all. So Barfield's a more coherent thinker, but probably a less satisfying Christian. I actually don't, I'm just going to say this, I actually don't consider Barfield a Christian. But I mean, I think it's easier if you don't try to force. Well, actually, his biographer says the same thing. He's got this he writes a chapter, and then he says, I wrote this first chapter for all these people who are reading the book because of the Inklings. And he says, but don't look for anything else after this. It's like, so, and I think he's right. I think it's more honest to read Barfield as an anthroposophist, as a committed anthroposophist.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no question in my conversation with his grandson and with others on this series that once Barfield was committed to anthroposophy, it was his life. He was a part of the committee. He was instrumental in developing and cultivating the ideas and even places of education connected to it. So,
which I think the Waldorf schools are probably doing good stuff. I mean, I ran into a school. I was in an airport one time waiting for a flight, and I saw about 30 kids come in with one teacher, right? Or maybe there were two, and they're going somewhere on the flight. And none of them are on phones. They don't have any devices, and they're all talking quietly with each other. And I walked over to the teacher and I said, "Are you guys any chance that you're Waldorf? She said, "Yeah, how did you guess?" I said, "Well, look, you don't get students like this." But anyway, it was amazing.
Yeah. I've only heard good things from the people who have been in or students of the Waldorf school. Yeah. So, beautiful. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say is that, I think that's the biggest difference. I think that fundamentally they shared a lot of the similar imaginary and intuitive experiences of the world, and they understood polarity, and they understood this. Like when Williams comes right down to it, he articulates an Augustinian view of evil as privation. That's what he says. What his imagery shows is not that. So there you go. Fascinating. Well, we all have to wrestle with some demons, I suppose. One of the things I really admire is these are men of great, profound intellect.
Absolutely.
And extraordinary legacies, and yet they had I hope, it seems, the humility or the temerity to approach one another with courtesy and respect, and how desperately we could gain from that in these days.
Absolutely. Good point. I want to say that it was very helpful when Williams joined the Inklings, because I think he was always the smartest guy in the room before that. But when he got in with these guys, he wasn't. And let me just say, and I tell my students this too, that I studied Williams for, before I did my PhD. I probably studied him carefully for 10 years. I didn't get to the bottom of him. I wasn't smart enough. I knew he was smarter than I was. And Barfield, you're dealing with something, these people, and Lewis too, and Tolkien. We need to realize how extraordinary and gifted they were. And there was they were funny with each other, I think, in the sense I think they probably ribbed each other a bit. But that they were great. But you're right about that idea of generosity. I mean, look at Lewis's relationship with Barfield. Barfield was his solicitor who managed his estate.
Right.
I mean, and and you get opposition is true friendship. You get these, and yeah, we do need that. That's a very good point, Derek. That we do need some of that. We need to be able to disagree, and we need humility. Like I feel like, and this is even more so with Kierkegaard when I studied him. We need humility. We need to realize that on our best days, we can catch a glimpse of these people at their worst days. Like we can really, but it's not like we're not peers. And I think that's one of the problems with criticism in general in literary studies is there needs to be, with everything, there needs to be more respect. There just
Yes.
needs to be like that. That's a good attitude to have. Respect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a blast. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to
Let me see here.
sign off with?
I don't know. I guess there was a couple things. I think that Barfield is going to be extremely useful. Let me just mention one of the people he influenced. Have you ever heard of Rupert Sheldrake? Okay, well here you go. He'll be a fun one for you. He had the only TED talk that was canceled. And then it got reinstated eventually. But he's got a book out. It's called what's it called? I think it's basically How to Save Science. But I read his stuff, and he was a very bright man, very bright. He was a kid. He ran a lab in Cambridge. Long story short, I recognized there was something of Barfield in him, and I wrote him an email. Got brave, and I wrote this guy.
Excellent.
I said, have you ever read? He said, yeah. It's funny you should ask. He said he was in an ashram in India. He was part of India's Green Revolution. He was working as a biologist there, right?
Sheldrake was.
Sheldrake was, and
Yeah.
it was the ashram that Dom Bede Giffith, I can't
Yes.
talk, did in India, and he had Barfield's books, and Sheldrake had been reading Barfield. He said he didn't understand very much of it, but he read it, and that's humility. Sheldrake is extremely bright. Anyway, you know who David Bentley Hart is?
Yes.
Okay, David Bentley Hart and Rupert Sheldrake have a YouTube video out where Hart considers the possibility that fields, which is something that Sheldrake talks about, are like final forms or forms in the Platonic causation or the Aristotelian causation.
Interesting.
And makes a very good argument. But Sheldrake has been going after this idea of consciousness being stuck in the head. He actually thinks there's all kinds of evidence. And he also thinks vision doesn't work. We're not passively just receiving, we're actually projecting as well. So he has experiments on the sense of being stared at. He says, which is extremely common. People
Yes.
talk about this. So Rupert Sheldrake's worth listening to. And he talks about the hard problem, the problem of consciousness. And I think that Barfield is going to help. The biggest thing that he can offer is he can offer us some ways to get around or through or past where we are now in modernism, because we've created a world that has no meaning, and Barfield recognized that this can descend into very bad imagination too, right? That there was a real danger, and Barfield can help as we struggle with modernism and as we struggle with meaninglessness, and he can provide some guidelines. We don't have to buy into the anthroposophical program. But he's right about his essential insights are right. And I think that he can provide a lot of help. And I find it so great that someone like Rupert Sheldrake, who's taking on the whole scientific establishment, that he's found Barfield helpful, I think. So that's all I would like to say, I guess.
That's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. Here's to the Renegades.
Yeah. Boy, yes. We each have to do our little bit.
That's right. That's right. Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word consciousness. 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 Consciousness is defined as the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings. It's also the awareness of perception of something by a person as well, and probably most germane to the conversation just concluded, is the fact of awareness by the mind of itself and the world. Consider this. How do you know you're conscious? What does your consciousness provide? Is it everything? Is it the only thing? Consciousness. To be aware. A fascinating concept. A fascinating reality as we attempt to make sense of some of this, of any of this, as we meander and stumble and wind our way through life with very little concrete guidance, other than, of course, centuries of those who have lived before and the hope and expectation of those yet to come. Guided by love, guided by hope and faith, we do our best to activate our consciousness, to expand our consciousness. There's a wide range and a deep variety of many things that we can inhabit and ingest, investigate. I don't know. I think a little bit from time to time about this notion of consciousness. And it's a close cousin to conscience, which, of course, is what we refer to as an awareness that we're perhaps being prodded and guided to make different choices. As Jiminy Cricket once sang, always let your conscience be your guide. Now, as I think about it, perhaps our conscience is a key indicator that we're conscious. You see? Think about it a little bit today. Be conscious of your choices. Avoid falling into ruts. Avoid getting into habits that blindly and mindlessly carry you away like flotsam and jetsam in the ever-churning tides. No, we want to be grateful, present, aware. Activate consciousness in the morning, in the midday, in the evening. Pause. Take account. Enjoy. Appreciate. Express gratitude. I'm expressing gratitude right now to consciousness for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.